So yes, I got my master's in museum studies here in 2003, and as part of that I got to be a proctor out at the Half-American Museum, so I got to take part in the preserving some of the objects. So like this little guy here, when these first came in, they were quite covered in sort of this black, greasy, sooty substance, and so part of my job was, with a very delicate solution and a Q-tip, to clean these guys up. And so it's great to kind of be able to come back and become reacquainted with some of these fantastic objects that I had the chance to work with as a student. As Geraldine mentioned, I'm a professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies, and the class that I'm teaching this semester, which some of you have the syllabus there, is Thawing the Frozen Indian, American Indian Museum Representations. And so the point of the class is sort of to walk the students through how the museums have traditionally displayed Native people and some of the stereotypes that come out of conventional museum display, on up through and examining some of the issues that American Indian people have had with museums, and also the utility that a lot of Indian people see in museums, the importance of having preserved some of these objects and make them available now for contemporary artists. And so we start off the semester with looking at these ideas of curio cabinets and what people were collecting at first and why they were collecting them. And so at the end, since there's not too many of you, we'll put out some gloves and you can come up and see some of these objects closer up. But in the meantime, I'll just sort of walk them back. And so this is one of the types of lovely things that people would have collected. It's a case that you could put your cigars in. And it's made out of birch bark. This is a lovely Huron piece. And it's embroidered with moose hair. And so this is, and then moose hair tufting there, and these sort of lovely floral patterns. And so this is one of the types of things that people would have collected, and it would have had some utility to folks, as well as being sort of lovely exotic thing. Folks were also initially collecting things like this fascinating little skin boat. This is from the late 1800s from the Aleutian Islands. And it would have been mostly traders, sailors, people wanting to bring something back to show that they had been to all these fascinating exotic places. And so some people were collecting life-size boats, and this was a much easier thing to be able to bring back at the end of your adventure on a whaling vessel. And so this is a lovely little example, because it's really clearly made by somebody who made these large-scale boats as well, because of the wonderful detail that went into, you could see the ribs in the kayak there. And so students love to be able to come and say, oh, how interesting is an over 100-year-old little bitty skin boat with such miraculous detail of what people, although I guess this type of parka would have been a little unusual with the fur on the outside, but somebody figured that the tourists, I guess, would like this fuzzy little guy peeking out of the boat. Other types of things, so this is, the students had sort of an interesting reaction to these here. So these are Teton, Dakota moccasins from the late 1800s, probably around 1890. And they're made with porcupine quills. So it's brain tan leather that somebody has used aniline dye on the quills, and so that's why they're sort of this very vibrant red and purple colors, as well as some beadwork. And so beads were introduced out in the plains in the sort of mid to early 1800s, became very popular more toward the late 1800s. But what's interesting about these is that there's still dirt on the bottom from the person who wore these. So you see somebody really put a lot of effort into quilling the bottoms of them. So this is really an important person who wore these. But this was something that for the students, it was like, well, this is a little, it made them think a little, like this wasn't just an object that somebody made for the tourist trade like that boat, but somebody wore these around. And this is the dirt from their homeland that's still stuck to the bottom of these shoes. And so for the collector, that would have been this great, like, oh look, it's very authentic. It's not just made for the tourist trade. Clearly this was something right out of Indian life that collectors were really trying to preserve, because the Indians were all disappearing. And so the idea was to scoop up all these objects and put them away in collections. So these are very authentic. I mean, you can still see the sort of footprint on the inside. Some guy clearly had his foot in these and was stomping around. And so for the students, it was sort of like, that's kind of neat, but ooh, it's sort of uncomfortable at the same time. Like, in what circumstances did this guy, whip off his shoes and be like, well, all right, sure, what are you going to offer me for them? So then, these are some of the other great objects. People were collecting objects as well as a way of sort of showing why Indians were disappearing. Because they're crazy, savage people, right? Like, who else makes something like this? And so Penobscot root clubs was something that artists carried beyond the time when they were used for utilitarian purposes. And so this was made in the early 1900s. People were not still bonking each other over the head with them at this point. So this is an art that sort of had a utilitarian purpose at one point that men have carried on for cultural reasons. And so as you can see, it's got these great faces carved into it. This is from the root ball of a tree, so it would have been sort of growing in the ground like this at one point. And so people yank these up and then carve these wonderful designs into them. And there are still families of men today who are passing down this tradition. But again, it was sort of this neat, exotic thing that people could collect and have in their house and show the wild and crazy Indians of Maine who had made these objects. What kind of tree was it? I think an ash tree is what I heard, or a birch tree. So yeah, guys still dig these up today. But you see that you can imagine if somebody's running at you with this, that it would be a fairly intimidating sort of thing. But I'm sure it was very effective in its time. Along the same lines of head bombers, this was another one we brought in this section. And tomahawks have this fascinating history in that you can see this is a pipe tomahawk. So it sort of has a peaceful end and a less peaceful end. And these were made in Europe, but specifically for a native market. So especially throughout the 1700s, when there was really much more of a balance of power. There was a lot more negotiating, treaty making going on, because Europeans did not yet quite have the strong advantage that they did in the 1800s. So there was much more of this trade relationship going on. So these were produced in Europe specifically for an indigenous market. People really liked this. It was very practical. This is a hollow stem. And so, a man could take this out, and as people were sitting around having talks, having negotiations, people could be smoking their tobacco. And there is a little bit of kind of burnt residue on the inside here. And then if you had to get up quick and negotiating didn't go so well, there's the other end of it here. And so this is a really fascinating piece. It's Cree from Saskatchewan. So again, these tomahawk heads are mostly made in the 1700s. Beyond that, when the balance of power really shifted toward European people, there wasn't as much of a need to be specifically producing trade goods to give to native people. So at that point it was more, well, we're just going to kind of fight them. And this has a Mexican peso attached to it. So it's Cree from Saskatchewan, and it's from 1897 is its coin, and then some Russian trade beads on here. So this really kind of shows the extent to which people were trading, were, I don't think the handle is as old as the head, so the way that things were circulating around, the fact that a Mexican peso made it all the way up to Saskatchewan to be added onto this Cree pipe is a really sort of interesting. It shows a lot of the different trade networks and the ways that ideas were kind of circulating around. And then this is an eagle feather with some wool hanging off of there. So a lot of interesting elements all added together. And then sort of along the lines of things that have been used, and that's what makes them interesting, we have this Whoopie water carrying jug from the 1850 is the date, and it has a corn cob stopper here, so it's kind of fun, and also a patch on the side. So somebody used this, broke it, repatched it up. These became less kind of in use toward the 1900s because people started using metal water buckets, which were a lot lighter to carry. So if you come up after and want to gently pick this up, you see it's got a little weight to it even without water in it. But people, were collecting things out of the Southwest. This was a good place to go and scoop up people's objects. There were lots of fascinating objects around. So I would have loved to have heard the negotiations with somebody and a lady, how they got her to part with her water canteen and kind of what they traded her in exchange for it. But the face on here, I'll put this down because it makes me is the Palikmana design. And so this is a design, sort of a water goddess. And she was used on the designs for girls' headdresses for part of their initiation ceremony. So you can imagine this being very much a woman's object and sort of an object connected to water, because that was, when you live in the very dry Southwest, this is something you spend a lot of time doing, is collecting water. So again, students have found it interesting, some of these objects that very clearly came out of people's lives and still have that evidence of having been used by someone at some time. And then we also talked about things that are sort of specifically made for the tourist market and that have been influenced by that. And so these, this is what Haudenosaunee beadwork looked like sort of in the mid-1800s. This is from about 1840s. And you see it's got a lot of these geometric designs. And so these were carried by women, but especially made for the tourist market. So Victorian women were buying these, and Jerry Byron has put together some interesting exhibits where he's taken a lot of old black and white photographs of Victorian ladies and Victorian families, and some of them have these little purses with them. It's sort of like their lovely prized possession, you know, that kind of fun little exotic thing that they picked up on vacation. So this sort of flat geometric style is more from the mid-1800s, so 1840s, 1850s. And then that sort of evolves into this much bunchier style with more colors, with more floral designs, and a raised style of beadwork. So these were sometimes called Niagara bags. So women would set up outside of the Niagara Falls. People would have blankets, and people would, you know, Victorian women would come and buy these purses from them. And so some Native women carried them as well. You see pictures of Caroline Parker, who is a famous Seneca woman, and so she has one of these bags with a very lovely beaded outfit. She's got kind of a matching bag to go with it. But again, Victorian women were also collecting these. These were kind of like the little Louis Vuitton bag of the time. It was this lovely, fancy, you know, exotic little bag. It showed that you had traveled, you had gone off to Niagara Falls and come back with this sort of little treasure that then grandmothers passed down. Some of these bags that people have collected have little notes tucked inside about somebody having brought this back from a trip to Niagara Falls. So this was kind of this interesting way of Haudenosaunee people preserving this art and also making it something that appealed to outside audiences. And that today is still seen as this very distinct style of cultural beadwork. And so here is a picture frame made by a Tuscarora lady in the early 90s. And so you can see people have still maintained this puffy style of Haudenosaunee beadwork that's popular, very distinctive. So people see that and know it's a Haudenosaunee woman that made that. And people are still selling these at powwows, out of gift shops for people to collect and hang on their wall and show that you've been to upstate New York or southern Canada. And so this is sort of part of my favorite parts of the collection as a beadworker. So I have a project here that's sort of in the works, but it's wonderful to be able to work with collections and see some of these beautiful things and then sort of be inspired. So this is going to be a pouch. It's still in the assembly phases, but again, this is some of the raised beadwork styles, and so it's fun to be able to work with objects when that's also your passion on the side. It's got pins sticking out of it, you have to be careful. You're welcome to come up and see this afterwards too. Anybody have any questions thus far? I'm just sort of sliding along. Let's see where in the syllabus we are.
Is your pouch going to be in the exhibit?
No. No, that's a gift. I have to hurry up and get that done before spring break. But no, not for the exhibit. Maybe if the museum wants to commission me in my spare time. We also did a section on consultation and conservation. And as part of that, the cradle's no longer in here, but one of the Kiowa cradles that Vanessa Jennings repaired when she came out here. We had Terry bring that to class. And so part of that was looking at to what extent should you leave things the way they are, because this is how it has survived into this present day, versus to what extent should you try to restore objects and make them look the way they would have looked when people were using them. So one example was this lovely little hat here, which when it came to the museum, as Terry described it, it was a wadded up little ball with a few tufts sticking out of it. And they really didn't even quite know what it was. It was part of something that people had donated. And once they spritzed it and misted it and got it all uncurled, The different kind of boning in there, that's the tufts there, and there's human hair poking out of it too. That was there, so the skeleton of the hat was there, but this whole half here that you can see that's a slightly different color was all missing. And so there was a lot of conversation around, well, do you leave it in its current condition, because this is how it has survived to this day, or do you go ahead and try to fill in the missing spaces with a similar material and show what it would have looked like? And so that's what they ended up doing. They had Alex, the conservator, use some fish gut to fill in this whole area. So now you can see it's this clever little hat. And so this was made, this is also from Alaska, and it was made to kind of replicate a Russian style of hat, but a very sort of indigenous, fashionable way of doing that. So now you can see what it would have looked like. It sort of has much more function and purpose than it did as this crumpled up thing or as this little skeletal type thing. In the case of the cradle board that Vanessa Jennings fixed, the community was saying, well, if these things are going to go on display, it doesn't make us look very good if the cradle board looks kind of shabby and falling apart. It's kind of sad. You know, these were, the name of the exhibit was Gifts of
Pride and Love.
Pride and Love. I always want to say pride and joy, but pride and love. And joy, because babies are joyful. So you make these things because you love your children, and they're very beautiful, and this is how it, like, you know, you show off this beautiful baby. And so to them it seemed kind of sad to have this crumbling, falling apart cradle. So this doesn't really represent what these were for and what they meant to us. And so she went through, and as much as possible, they got older beads and repaired it and matched it up. And the community was more comfortable with that going on display because it was beautiful again. So there was sort of a whole discussion around to what extent do you try to repair things. Because anytime you bring up the Denver Art Museum, you see Terry cringe. No, things are beautiful and clean there. You know, they've sandblasted off every little speck of dirt, and it looks like all brand new, beautiful stuff. Which is sort of how it might have looked when somebody first made this object, in the 1900s. But at the same time, it doesn't reflect any of the use or the wear or the history of that object, which is the difference between an anthropology museum and an art museum, right? We're interested in that process. The Denver Art Museum might not have left all of that crusty dirt on the bottom of this moccasin because it's sort of hiding some of the quill work. But in an anthropology museum, that's sort of what makes that interesting, the fact that somebody wore that around and picked up that dirt on their feet. And as part of the consultation portion of class, we also talked about working with Indigenous communities to decide what to display and what not to display. So I don't know if it went back already. There was a pipe here, and the discussion about the proper way to display a pipe and a stem, and not to connect them, but to keep them separated, and the discussions that some Indigenous communities have had with museums around what's just not appropriate to display. Things like Haudenosaunee masks that are used in medicine societies that some museums have wanted to put up and tell that story, and the communities have said, no, we're not comfortable with having those on display. So the Half and Rifle also has some of those objects. Things like ghost dance shirts the communities have asked to keep covered up and don't make open to the public. What's that?
So that's interesting.
Museum ghost dance shirt, museum staff don't even know.
Yeah, so that stays covered up. When Terry gave us the tour of the museum, he just sort of gestured to that drawer and said, that's what's in there, but we don't show that to people. So, that kind of starts the discussion, well, what's a museum for? If you have to house these objects that nobody can see, what then is the point of that? But again, if the community decides someday that they want to come back for that shirt, it's there, it's preserved.
When you're saying the community group,
Dakota people who sort of originally produced that shirt. And the ghost dance has this very painful history of, a lot of people were massacred for doing this type of prayer dance, and so they're saying, well, it's not appropriate to put this on display. It has this very painful history. It was something very special and sacred. We don't necessarily want it back because it has this painful history attached to it, but we don't want it displayed either. And so it's a matter of kind of, well, we'll hang on to it until we can decide what's the best course of action to do with something like that.
would they allow an anthropologist who's doing a dissertation or something like that?
I guess you'd have to contact the Dakota people, whoever the whoever was the tribal historic preservation officer, or whoever out there, and say, how do people feel about this person coming by to do that? It would probably depend on how this anthropologist approached the community. Would probably have a big say to what extent. an insensitive person might just go and say, hey, I want to have a look at this, but it's sort of much better protocol and politics to go with what the community said they want done with the project. Sort of along those lines, we also talked about NAGPRA and issues of repatriation. And so this was one of the objects at the Hafenwerfer that was sort of subject to NAGPRA. This is a Hoover headdress. It's part of a girl's initiation ceremony. So you can see there's these wonderful pinking sheared feathers on the top of it here. And so I guess when the Hoover came by to have a look, they were trying to reacquire some of their ceremonial objects. And they said that this one is from a dance that's no longer done. And so they didn't see a point really in taking back this object because the dance is no longer done. Another part of the issue that they've had in trying to recollect some of their ceremonial dancewear from around the country is that at one point, the best way that museologists saw to keep bugs off of objects like these was to dust them with arsenic, because that killed everything. Because it's a real problem when bugs get into a museum collection. They just go wild and eat everything up. And so arsenic was a good way of killing anything that might be eating up your fur and feathers. But the problem is in trying to then wear these objects. You don't want to be wearing a headdress that's been dusted with arsenic, because then it will be sweating on it, because then it will get into your skin. So here's something that they had said, okay, go ahead and keep that in your collections, because we don't necessarily have a use in the community for it the way that they do some of the other headdresses that we're looking for. Does anybody have any questions? I think that's about.
Did they say what the dance was?
This one was from a girl's puberty dance, and so that was different from, nobody does this dance anymore. So they said, well, there's no point in just taking back something that we don't necessarily have use for. And so that brings us up to our last class that we just had was tribal museums, and so as part of that, we took a trip down to the Mashantucket Pequot Museum, which is kind of very starkly different. I don't know, has anybody here been to the Mashantucket Museum? It's not really an object-based museum, and so it's much more around kind of exhibits and themes and recreations and dioramas, and so it was interesting for them to compare that to a lot of the museums that we've been in the Hafenwerfer, which is very much based on the objects and the collections. I think the last thing that I forgot to bring out here, kind of along the lines of beautiful things that people collected. So this is a lovely object in that it brings together the traditional art of quill work that women on the plains were doing up until the early 1800s when beads came, with these sort of smaller seed beads. So this is from the late 1800s, and it's got this great horsehair on it and different on each side. So this is something that collectors especially love to scoop up. This is a pipe bag. And so the museum has several of these in the collection, but I thought this was one of the loveliest because it combines the quill work with the beadwork. Any questions? If not, if you wanted to come up and see some of the things closer up, we have gloves here. If you want to more close example.
I have a couple of questions. Can you talk a little bit more about using the material culture in your class? Would you have been able to teach this course without access to these objects? Did this enhance the course?
I think it would have been very different to have everybody sitting around just in a classroom and to be talking about the importance of some of these objects in Native communities without having them be able to actually see these objects. So things like these moccasins, to be able to see close up how in the beadwork, how really beautiful it is, even aside from its kind of cultural purposes, that people say, wow, it clearly took somebody a really long time to make something like this. And I think you can be told that, but it's different to actually be able to pass around those objects and just to be able to say, that's really neat that these have survived up until this point, because the museum has curated them, has had them here, has cleaned all the soot and grime off of them and preserved them. So again, part of what we're talking about is the balance between how Native people can be upset with museums for scooping up all these objects out of their communities, but at the same time, how artists are going back to museums and saying, we'd like to have a look at this beadwork. So a lot of Haudenosaunee beadworkers like to go to these exhibits and look at these 100, 200-year-old pouches and say, look at how they did that, look at how they tacked this down. So even something that's a living, continuing art in communities, people like to go and see older versions of these objects and sort of be re-inspired by some of these beautiful things. So there's that balance of making these objects available to students, to the public to learn about these things, and also to Indigenous artists and Indigenous people to be able to see these as well. But having these here and having the students be like, all right, so in looking at these objects, how do we then construct an exhibit about what these mean to people? So we have some other things that are coming in. And there are some other lovely things that had to go back to the museum because I ran out of room in the cabinet. For like 1 week, we brought in these vests from the late 1800s from the Santee Sioux that had quills and needed American flags on them. So these are being made around the time that people are being massacred all over the Dakotas and Minnesota. And so just to see, you know, this vest that people were wearing that has American flags on it, to think, you know, what was going on in a community that people would try to adopt this symbol. You know, was it a, look, I killed 2 American soldiers and that's why I have this flag? Was it a, let's try to ally ourselves with these folks and, you know, please don't shoot me, look, I have American flags on. So it sort of makes it that much more poignant when you're there in the presence of this, 100-plus-year-old vest and trying to think about what motivated people to produce these objects and wear these objects.
Did you develop your syllabus knowing that you'd have access to these objects, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this, I kind of took some themes from books and from other people's syllabi who have taught different museum courses, but a part of it was being able, sitting down with Terry and saying, okay, touring through there and saying, what are the type of things that we can bring in that people can see? So clearly the only challenge there is having enough room to store these things. So we also had like a Navajo rug and a cradle that had to go back because there's just not the room here to store them. And there's some other bigger things that have stayed out at the half and refer because it would just be a big hassle to have to lug it in. But looking at sort of the portable size objects that people can come in and see and think about how to incorporate them into a little exhibit like that. So.
Great.
So that's.
And your class is going to make an exhibit?
Yes, and so they're still toying around with different ideas for part of it. So yes, I think the cigar store Indian may still make an appearance, but part of it is sort of looking at representation and how kind of Western American people have appropriated Western, indigenous representation, but also in looking at objects like there's a pair of beaded sneakers in there. So how have indigenous people also sort of nativized, Western objects like that? So we'll see how it all. That's just the first conversation that's happening around that exhibit. They may change their minds. I'm just sort of there to guide and make sure nothing too crazy comes out.
Is it going to be called the Frozen Indian, or is that?
I don't know what they're going to call it. So this has been sort of like, all right, I'm going to come up with these themes and this list of reading and these objects, and let's see what you guys come out of this. So we will see.
Do your students have access to the collection at Half and Refer? Is it searchable? I mean, how would
So this is part of kind of what we were discussing. It's semi-searchable. So we took a field trip out to the Half and Refer, and Terry, the walking encyclopedia, Terry Gentis is a curator out there, and so he knows every story of every object, and so he gave them a tour kind of the North American collections and told some of the stories behind the different dresses and shoes and clubs and baskets and all manner of treasures out there. So the students got the kind of walkthrough of the museum. And then there's sort of a searchable PDF, so if you plug in, basket or club, you can see how many different baskets are in the North American collection.
Thank you so much.